You don't even remember when it started, not exactly. It wasn't one breakup, one betrayal, one moment of abandonment. It was slower, quieter, like fog rolling in on a still lake. You were surrounded by people, family, friends, co-workers, yet somehow you were floating outside of it all. You smiled when they smiled. You nodded at the right times. You laughed when you were supposed to. But inside, it felt like you were watching your life happen from the other side of glass. Like the world was still moving, but you were standing still. And eventually, you gave it a name: loneliness, because that's what they tell you it is. That ache in your chest, that weight behind your eyes, that silent scream you carry into every room. It must be loneliness, right? A lack of connection, a missing piece, a social deficiency. So you scroll more, you text first, you go out even when you're tired, you smile wider, but it doesn't help. Because the truth is, you're not starving for company. You're starving for something else entirely. So let me ask you something, and I want you to feel it in your chest before you answer. What if your loneliness isn't a problem to fix, but a message to hear? What if that silence you've been trying to drown out isn't empty space, but a doorway, a threshold, a waiting room? Because here's the truth no one tells you. Loneliness isn't always the absence of others. It's the presence of yourself, finally arriving. The reason you feel separate isn't because no one's around. It's because your soul is stepping forward, and it doesn't speak the language of small talk and surface smiles. It wants something deeper, realer, raw. And when the real self begins to rise, it disrupts the version of you that used to play along. You feel the shift before you can name it. Suddenly the parties feel louder, the jokes feel emptier, the conversations feel scripted. You don't know what's wrong, you just know something doesn't fit anymore. The mask doesn't sit right. The laughter feels forced, and the more you pretend, the lonelier you become. But what if that ache isn't abandonment, it's awakening? What if this loneliness you're carrying isn't a curse, but a signal that you're being asked to stop performing and start listening? That the space opening up inside you isn't meant to be filled with noise, but with truth? See, we've been taught to fear being alone. We've been told it means we're unlovable, unwanted, unseen, but that's a lie designed to keep us desperate for validation. Because the most dangerous thing you can ever do, the most radical act, is to sit with yourself long enough to actually meet the parts of you no one else sees. Carl Jung understood this. He didn't run from his solitude. He walked directly into it. For 6 years, he turned inward, not because he gave up on the world, but because he was finally willing to meet himself. And what he found there didn't come wrapped in light. It came in symbols, in silence, in visions that didn't ask to be explained, only faced. He called it a descent, but it wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough, a confrontation with the unconscious. And in that darkness, he didn't discover madness. He discovered meaning. So what if your loneliness is the same thing? Not a void, but a voice. Not punishment, but passage. Not exile, but invitation. An invitation to step away from everything that was never really you. From the roles you played, the expectations you carried, the versions of yourself you shaped just to be accepted. And in that sacred quiet, beneath the noise, beneath the scrolling, beneath the pretending, you'll start to hear something else. A whisper you forgot was yours, a truth you buried to belong, a self you've been circling your entire life. What if you're not alone at all? What if you're just finally in a room where the only voice left to hear is the one that matters most? Yours. But what happens when you finally hear your own voice and you don't recognize it? What happens when the silence gets so deep it echoes? That's the moment most people run. They reach for distractions, for noise, for someone, anyone to fill the space. But Carl Jung didn't run. He stayed. And what he discovered wasn't comfort, it was confrontation. For 6 years, Jung stepped away from the world. not because he was broken, not because he'd lost his way, but because he knew that something deeper was trying to rise. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. A descent, not into madness, but into meaning. He wasn't seeking connection with others. He was seeking connection with himself. And he knew that meant solitude, real solitude. The kind that strips away every title, every mask, every theory, until all that's left is the raw material of your soul. During those years, Jung wrote what would become his most mysterious and sacred work, the Red Book. Not a theory, not a clinical study, a journey, a document of what happens when you stop running and start listening to the voices inside you that you've spent your whole life avoiding. This book wasn't meant to be published while he was alive. It was too personal, too sacred, too raw, because in it, Jung recorded visions, terrifying, beautiful, symbolic visions, conversations with figures he met in the depths of his psyche. Gods, shadows, archetypes. He didn't analyze them. He didn't label them. He let them speak. And here's the part most people don't understand. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't delusional. He was encountering the pieces of himself that had been buried, denied, forgotten. And in that space of sacred solitude, they rose, not to haunt him, but to guide him. One of those figures was Philemon, a wise inner guide, a kind of soul teacher who emerged not from outside Jung, but from within. Then came the Red One, a dark, seductive, chaotic force that embodied all the repressed desires Jung had never dared to name. These weren't imaginary friends. They were fragments of Jung's own psyche, each one representing a truth he'd once silenced. Because here's the secret no one talks about. When you get lonely enough, quiet enough, still enough, you start meeting the others inside you. The younger self still grieving, the creative self still waiting, the angry self still hiding, the sacred self still sleeping. And suddenly, that room that once felt empty is crowded, not with strangers, but with forgotten versions of you. So no, Jung wasn't lonely. He was surrounded by the voices of the selves he had abandoned to survive. And rather than suppress them, he sat with them, he listened, he painted them, he spoke with them. He made a home for the very parts of himself the world had no room for. And that's the invitation the Red Book extends, not just to psychologists, not just to scholars, but to you, to stop pathologizing your aloneness, to stop seeing solitude as a defect, and instead to treat it as a sacred encounter, a meeting, a reunion. Because when the world grows quiet enough, the unconscious starts to speak. And it doesn't speak in logic, it speaks in dreams, in symbols, in strange images that don't make sense to your mind, but make perfect sense to your soul. And when you begin to honor those messages, something shifts. You realize you're not as alone as you thought. In fact, you're standing in a crowded room, only now you're finally listening. So what if you stopped resisting the silence? What if you made space at your table for the voices that have long gone unheard? The angry voice, the grieving voice, the joyful voice, the voice that's never been safe enough to speak. What if you stopped trying to fix your loneliness and started exploring it as a map, as a teacher, as a doorway back to yourself? Carl Jung didn't leave society because he was lost. He left because he was finally ready to return. Not to the world, but to himself. So ask yourself, what if this loneliness isn't emptiness, but arrival? What if you're not broken, just beginning to remember who you really are? So if Jung's solitude wasn't isolation, but initiation, then what if yours is too? You see, we're taught to treat loneliness like a glitch in the system, something to be patched, medicated, or erased. A sign that something's wrong with us, that we're lacking, that we're broken. But what if that's not true? What if loneliness isn't a flaw in your programming, but the moment the program crashes so you can finally see the truth? Because here's what most people don't realize. Loneliness often shows up right before the mask starts to slip. The version of you that kept the peace, that fit in, that smiled on command, that chased approval like oxygen. It worked until it didn't. Until something inside you said, "This isn't me." Until pretending felt heavier than disappearing. Until you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the eyes staring back. That's when the loneliness begins. Not because you're truly alone, but because the old identity no longer fits and the new one hasn't fully formed. You're not empty, you're in between. The stage has gone quiet, the costume has come off, and for the first time, you're standing there, without a script. That silence, that ache, that's not punishment. That's the space your real self has been waiting to breathe in. Your loneliness is not a malfunction, it's a threshold. And Jung knew this better than anyone. He wrote, "The person who has not passed through the inferno of their passions has never overcome them." In other words, if you've never sat in the fire of your own silence, if you've never let the loneliness burn through every false identity, you've never really met your soul. Because the real self doesn't speak through noise. It doesn't rise when you're surrounded, celebrated, or performing. It shows up when there's nothing left to perform for. It arrives when everything external has gone quiet, and all that's left is you. Not the curated you, not the filtered you, just you, untamed, uncomfortable, unknown. And this is where most people panic. They think, "I've lost myself." But the truth is, you're finally shedding the self that was never truly yours. The people pleaser, the perfectionist, the peacemaker, the strong one, the one who never asked for too much, never spoke too loudly, never needed too deeply. That version of you wasn't fake, it was adaptive. It got you here, it helped you survive, but it was never meant to be your home. Now that it's breaking down, the silence isn't a void, it's a birthing ground, a sacred cocoon between who you were and who you're becoming. Carl Jung believed that this descent into inner silence wasn't just healthy, it was necessary. He said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And those things are often spiritual truths, soul truths, the kind that don't fit neatly into dinner conversation or text messages, the kind you can only hear when you're willing to go quiet enough, long enough, to let the unconscious speak. Because in Jungian psychology, the unconscious isn't just a dumping ground for forgotten memories, it's the womb of the self. It's where the real you sleeps, waiting for the day you finally stop living on autopilot and start listening inward. So maybe that's what your loneliness is trying to do. Not hurt you, but wake you, to pull you out of a life that was too shallow for your depth, to strip away every borrowed identity until only your essence remains, to bring you to the edge of everything you thought you needed, so you could finally see what you truly are. It's not easy, it's not comfortable, it won't be quick, but if you stay, if you hold your ground inside the silence, you'll begin to feel something underneath the ache, a presence, a flicker, a warmth you haven't felt in years. That's you, not the mask, not the image, the original you waiting to be remembered. So no, your loneliness isn't punishment. It's preparation, a sacred unmaking, the breaking of old forms to make space for something true. You're not losing yourself. You're meeting yourself for the first time. So how do you know it's happening? How do you know you're not just spiraling, not just falling apart, but falling into yourself, into something more honest than you've ever dared to live? There are signs, subtle at first, then undeniable. The first is this: you stop craving the noise, the parties, the constant texts, the background hum of entertainment. All of it begins to feel loud. Not wrong, just wrong for you. It's not that you're antisocial. It's not that you're afraid. You're simply no longer willing to drown out your own voice just to feel included. You realize that the silence you once ran from isn't empty. It's sacred. You don't need the world to get louder. You need to get still, because something is trying to speak. Then, one day, you look at an old photo or hear your own voice in an old video, and you feel it. Distance, not nostalgia, not shame, just space, because you don't recognize that version of yourself anymore. The one who said yes to everything, who twisted themselves into someone else's idea of enough. That person isn't fake. They were just performing. And now the performance is over. The armor has cracked. You've started peeling back the layers, and what you're finding underneath doesn't look like who you used to be. That's okay. That's the point. And somewhere in that quiet, a whisper begins. A voice. At first, you don't trust it. You question whether it's real or just your imagination. But it's steady, gentle, clear. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It waits. That voice isn't coming from outside you. It's rising from within. It says things like, leave the room, take the break, say the truth. It speaks in instincts, in gut reactions, in boundaries you didn't used to have the courage to draw. It's not always comfortable, but it is always honest. You start noticing something else too. Disconnection, not from yourself, but from the world you used to orbit. Conversations that once felt easy now feel exhausting. Crowds feel heavier. Small talk drains you. It's not that you're better than anyone else. It's just that you're tuned to a different frequency now. You can no longer fake interest in things that don't nourish your soul. You're not disconnected. You're being unplugged from illusions. And that unhooking, it hurts. But it's also the first breath of freedom. And then comes the shift. The one that changes everything. You stop chasing people who can't meet you. You stop explaining yourself. You stop performing for permission. You stop begging to be understood. Not because you don't care, but because you finally do. You care enough about yourself to choose your own presence over someone else's approval. You choose solitude over shrinking, truth over comfort, self-respect over attention. You don't stop loving people, you just stop abandoning yourself to keep them. You stop trading your authenticity for access. You stop diluting who you are to stay digestible. And when you do, when you choose you, everything begins to realign. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But that becoming, it's not a straight line. It's not a highlight reel, it's a stripping away, a sacred unbecoming. And these signs, they aren't breakdowns. They're markers, signals that your soul is finally being given space to surface. So if you find yourself losing interest in what used to excite you, if you feel strangely detached from your past self, if you hear an inner voice and don't know whether to trust it, if you feel alone in crowds, yet deeply connected in stillness, if you're choosing your own peace over being understood by people who never really saw you, you're not broken. You're not lost. You're meeting your real self. And yes, it's lonely, but it's also holy, because this isn't isolation. This is revelation. So here you are. You've outgrown the noise. You've slipped out of the costume. You've heard the voice rising inside. You've chosen yourself again and again, even when it cost you comfort, connection, or clarity. And now you've arrived at the quietest part of the journey. The space after the mask falls, but before the new self fully forms. The space that feels like floating in the dark, like walking without a map, like being utterly, terrifyingly alone. But you're not. What if I told you that this silence, this stillness you're sitting in, isn't empty at all? What if this is the moment your soul has been waiting for? Carl Jung didn't write the Red Book to escape his pain. He didn't descend into solitude to recover from some mental wound. He went there to meet the soul he had lost along the way. He sat in the silence, not to fix himself, but to remember himself. He let the loneliness deepen until it became sacred, until it stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like initiation. Because that's what this is, not isolation, not absence, a ritual. A rite of passage the world forgot how to honor. A homecoming without music, without ceremony, just you, finally hearing the sound of your own soul echoing through the halls of your being. This space you're in, it's not a void, it's a womb, and like all sacred births, it begins in the dark. It begins with silence, with waiting, with listening. Loneliness isn't a hole to fill. It's a holy place where all the pieces you left behind start coming home. Your curiosity, your anger, your softness, your intuition, your forgotten dreams, the child you buried, the elder you've never met, the real you, not performing, not pleasing, just present. But here's the part no one tells you. You can't meet that self if you're constantly looking for someone else to sit beside you. Not because love isn't real, but because no one can keep you company if you don't know how to sit with yourself. You don't need to be rescued from this moment. You need to remain in it long enough to feel the shift, long enough to realize you were never truly alone. You were just surrounded by echoes of everything you're not. We spend so much of our lives seeking connection, but what if the most profound connection you'll ever have isn't with another person, but with the parts of you you've exiled? What if the ache you feel in solitude isn't a cry for company, but a call to communion with your deepest self? Jung understood this. He knew the psyche was layered, sacred, mythic, and he knew that healing didn't come from running toward others, but from turning inward with reverence. That's why he didn't write the Red Book for the world. He wrote it for the voice inside that had gone unheard for too long. So maybe you don't need more distraction. Maybe you don't need to get over it. Maybe you don't need another text, another night out, another reassurance that you're not alone. Maybe you just need to sit with yourself, quietly, honestly, long enough to hear the voice that never left. The one that whispers, "I'm still here. I always have been." And when you hear it, not as a concept, but as a presence, everything changes. The loneliness loses its sharpness. The silence stops feeling cold. Because now you understand. This isn't emptiness. It's fullness too big to fit into your old life. You are not lonely. You are in sacred company, your own.